Good afternoon to esteemed judges of the Supreme Court of India and high courts across the country, judicial officers including juvenile justice magistrates, special and district and sessions court judges, directors and members of the state judicial academies, researchers, scholars, teachers from various institutions, colleagues, and friends. On behalf of SAMVAD, I, Shubham, and my colleague Nandita from the policy and law team extend our warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today for the online release of the study report, Factors Impacting Judicial Making on Juvenile Transfer in India, undertaken by SAMVAD.
SAMVAD is a national initiative and integrated resource for child protection, mental health, and psychosocial care, established by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, and is located in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS, in Bangalore. Working in 4 thematic areas of care and protection, education, mental health, and policy and law, SAMVAD provides a range of technical support activities relating to training, teaching, and research across the country. It is SAMVAD's utmost privilege to welcome Honorable Mrs. Justice B.V. Nagratna, Judge, Supreme Court of India, and member, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee of the Supreme Court. We are also pleased to welcome Honorable Mr. Justice Madan B. Lokur, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, and former Chairperson, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee of the Supreme Court.
Since the enactment of the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Children's Act in 2015, the statutory provision for juvenile transfer has been the subject of significant debate and discussion. Judicial officers tasked with the implementation of Section 15 of the 2015 Act have found its implementation to be challenging given the existing conceptual tension between the statutory mechanism for juvenile transfer and the objectives of the JJ Act. In light of this, SAMVAD-NIMHANS conducted a countrywide study involving juvenile justice magistrates, special and children's court judges, and district and sessions court judges in order to develop an understanding of judicial approaches to juvenile transfer decision-making in the status quo. It is the first such study conducted at a pan-India level with the participation of 742 judicial officers from 16 high court jurisdictions to understand judicial decision-making in the juvenile transfer process.
We are privileged to invite Honorable Mrs. Justice B.V. Nagratna, Judge, Supreme Court of India, and member, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee of the Supreme Court, to release the study report, Factors Impacting Judicial Decision Making on Juvenile Transfer in India, and to deliver the opening remarks on the significance of the study.
I have the privilege of releasing the Factors Impacting Judicial Decision Making on Juvenile Transfer in India, the report of the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Ladyship. May I request you to deliver the opening remarks on the significance of this study?
Thank you. Honorable Justice B. Lokur, Madan B. Lokur, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, and a person who has given momentum to juvenile justice in India, Dr. Shekhar Sheshadri, former Director NIMHANS, Dr. John Vijaya Sagar, SAMVAD, Ms. Sheila Ramaswamy, Technical and Operational Lead, SAMVAD, the other persons who are so deeply involved with SAMVAD, learned researchers of SAMVAD, learned judicial officers who have joined in across the country, directors from the state judicial academies, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to each one of you and namaskar. At the outset, I must thank SAMVAD for inviting me to release this research report on factors impacting judicial decision making on juvenile transfer in India and to give my introductory remarks. I'm very impressed to note that SAMVAD has conducted a countrywide study involving judges of the juvenile justice boards, and we just learned that about 741 judges have responded. And not only them, but special and children's court judges, district and sessions court judges have also participated in the study. The study is in order to develop an understanding of judicial responses to juvenile transfer decision making. I must congratulate SAMVAD for collaboratively engaging in this study, which is one of the first primary studies on judicial decision making in the context of juvenile transfer in India. I must highlight one significant aspect of the study in light of the general landscape of juvenile justice delivery system as it stands in India today. It is necessary to understand the types of variables and factors that judges consider while undertaking preliminary assessment and making decisions on transfer. It is also necessary to identify the extent of judicial officers' child orientation and the use of discretion by judges in approaching and interpreting the three evaluative criteria under Section 15. Of course, for this enlightened audience, I need not repeat those, but for the sake of refreshing of it, I would say that the three criteria are: one, that the child must have the physical and mental capacity to have committed the offense; two, the circumstances of the offense must be considered; and three, the child must have knowledge of the consequences of the offense. Transferring an adolescent offender to an adult court is a weighty decision. For the adolescent, transfer to the adult system holds the possibility of a harsher punishment, including physical, sexual, or psychological victimization by other inmates, and enduring developmental costs. Studies also suggest that adolescents in the adult system may be at risk of disruption in their personal development, identity formation, relationships, learning, growth in skills and competencies, and positive movement into adult status. On the other hand, for the system, transferring an adolescent to adult court is an unambiguous statement that the criminal justice system will no longer shelter the adolescent by virtue of his or her acts from harsh justice. Transfer to adult court indicates that the demand for proportional punishment has trumped the goal of individualized rehabilitation found in the juvenile justice system. The Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Children Act 2015 enables, in my view, a multidisciplinary inquiry by a JJB consisting of a principal magistrate and two social workers sitting as a bench into juvenile crime in a child-friendly manner in order to pursue the ends of justice. The JJB therefore has to take into consideration the concerns of the victims, if any, and public interest. These inquiries are to focus not only on establishing the guilt of the juvenile but delinquent, but also on understanding the juvenile and his or her circumstances, as well as the motives and the root causes that may have played a role in the commission of the crime. In cases where the juvenile is allegedly a co-accused with an adult, the law forbids joint trials. In the Indian context, the juvenile transfer law in the JJ Act stipulates that any child aged 16 to 18 years accused of committing a heinous offense must be subject to a preliminary assessment to ascertain whether the child is to remain within the juvenile jurisdiction, or whether the child possesses sufficient maturity and understanding in order to be transferred to the criminal justice system. The requisites are three in number, which I have already stated. What are the responsibilities of the board in carrying out the preliminary assessment? What are the relevant considerations to be placed on the balance while determining whether a child within the age group of 16 to 18 years should be tried as an adult? These are aspects of the matter that need discussion and attention. It is in this broad context that the study gains immense significance. The wisdom of the current transfer policies has been widely questioned on two major concerns, and the potential impacts of these practices have been voiced in the study. The first concern is about fairness. Does placement in an adult court expose adolescents to punishments and conditions that are unduly harsh? The second concern is about utility. Does the practice of juvenile transfer to adult court actually reduce crime as compared with placement in juvenile courts? What we find is that the available resources focuses on the effects of the juvenile transfer law on the delinquent, on society, and the criminal justice system. However, the critical question that has to be adequately addressed by these studies is with regard to the exercise of judicial discretion in transfer decision making, with respect to the manner in which decision makers must integrate a child-centric perspective to juvenile transfer decision making. Whether judicial decision making today is truly guided by factors which unequivocally establish the maturity of the adolescent offender, his or her physical and mental capacity, and his or her ability to understand the consequences of the criminal actions, it is also essential to determine and understand what such factors may be. This study pertinently seeks to address these critical aspects by conducting a foray into judicial decision making and identifying the considerations that are often placed at the balance while making determinations that are often placed as follows: whether an adolescent child should be tried as an adult as provided under Section 15 of the Act. This study is premised on the idea that standardization of the methodology in the implementation of Section 15 of the Act is critical to ensure that judicial decision making in the context of juvenile transfer is reasoned and scientifically informed by the relevant disciplines of adolescent development and neurosciences. In this regard, I wish to allude to the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Barun Chandra Thakur versus Master Bolu in order to appreciate the significance of this study. The Supreme Court in the said case highlighted the need for the approach to shift from reliance on scarcely available experts to standardized assessment methodologies implemented by trained mental health professionals, child protection functionaries, and psychosocial workers. The court further cautioned that the mere IQ of the adolescent would not be determinative of the mental capacity of the child. It was further held that in every case, 1, the mental capacity of an adolescent, and 2, ability to understand consequences of a criminal act have to be considered as two independent and distinct considerations while determining whether a child within the age of 16 to 18 years should be tried as an adult. These are indeed overlapping considerations, but yet have to be kept distinct. Moving forward, I shall now make an attempt to outline some of the commonly cited difficulties in operationalizing the transfer provisions contained in the JJ Act and how the same may be overcome through standardization of judicial attitudes and methodology for implementation of the transfer provisions. First, difficulties arising due to the fact that the Act does not define or operationalize various terms contained in the transfer provisions, such as mental capacity, circumstances of the offense, or knowledge of the consequences of the offense, pose a difficulty in themselves. It is in this context that I must emphasize on the importance of curating a special curricula for judicial personnel dealing with transfer cases. The curriculum should focus on the restorative framework, including the key provisions of the JJ Act in accordance with the directions of the Supreme Court in Barun Chandra Thakur. The second difficulty is the individualized assessment of adolescent maturity, which is not possible in all cases. Decision makers must be adequately equipped to deliver justice in a fair and age-appropriate manner, after understanding the circumstances in which the child has been placed in a holistic perspective and bearing in mind the relevant provisions of the JJ Act, as well as various elements of child and adolescent psychology or developmental psychology and therapeutic jurisprudence. Further, decision makers must be educated and trained on rehabilitative and restorative approaches that are not only child-centric and child rights or child justice oriented, but such that would reduce recidivism. Scientific research reveals that adolescent criminal conduct is driven by transitory influences that are constitutive of this developmental stage. Adolescents are also greatly influenced by their environment. Therefore, it is a multitude of factors that drive them into life of crime and also determine the nature of crime or the offense. It is not merely a mental capacity or cognitive capacity that drives a juvenile or an adolescent to commit a particular offense. Therefore, to axiomatically draw inferences from the nature of the offense alone would be a travesty of justice. Further, in making transfer decisions, the decision makers must not be swayed simply by the fact that the crime committed by a juvenile has evoked moral or public outrage and has prompted intense debate in society or raised strong opinions with regard to the treatment of the juvenile. Additionally, there is an imperative for judicial personnel and judges to work with mental health professionals and non-judicial members of the JJPs in transdisciplinary ways that adhere to constitutional safeguards and knowledge from legal and non-legal disciplines. The nature and quality of judicial education will ultimately determine the ease and fairness with which transfer decisions are made. Friends, having stressed on the importance of standardization of judicial attitudes and methodology for implementation of the transfer provisions, I must clarify that I am by no means suggesting a one-size-fits-all solution to deal with juvenile delinquency. Every child has a different need and every adult is different. And in the process of mainstreaming every child with the same standard, one of the dangers we face is that we lose sight of the individual's particular needs of rehabilitation and care, which could result in a relapse. All human beings, especially growing children, need to be taught that there are consequences of their actions for which they will be held accountable. However, the means for ensuring such accountability should be grounded in child or adolescent psychology, the human rights of children, and a deeper understanding of the circumstances that lead to criminal behavior and action. By dealing with juveniles as adults and sending them to adult prisons, the state will effectively deny them access to rehabilitative and restorative interventions under the Act that are absent in the adult system. Further, the adversarial mode of adult criminal trial is distinct from the child-friendly hearing provided under the JJ Act. Therefore, transferring a child as an adolescent offender and to an adult court must be invoked only as a measure of last resort in exceptional circumstances and not to be done in a mechanical manner. A blanket transfer order of a person who commits serious crimes to the adult system would imply a presumption that such juvenile is not amenable to reform. Yet, an individualized approach is also not bereft of its own concerns. On this occasion, I wish to make a plea to all the stakeholders to rededicate ourselves to investing time and effort for the improvement of juvenile justice and the juveniles in our country, to reform and rehabilitate them into the community with dignity. The way forward should therefore be to demonstrate that the reformative, rehabilitative model does work, and that as a country with one of the strongest constitutions in the world and a wealth of healing solutions, we have the vision and the heart, but we need to implement that in its true spirit. Our children, our victims of juvenile crime, and our society deserve no less. On that note, I once again congratulate SAMVAD for engaging in this study and bringing out a comprehensive report on the factors impacting judicial decision making on juvenile justice in India. I hope the study will scientifically guide judicial discretion and limit the propensity of arbitrariness. This study, in my view, will also contribute towards informing judicial education and decision making on juvenile transfer. On this occasion, I would appeal to all the directors of the state judicial academies to have a separate curricula as well as a training program on sections 15, 16, and 18 of the Act, so that there is a focus, and to have the most appropriate resource persons for training this for conducting this training program. I once again thank the organizers for inviting me to deliver the introductory remarks and to release the study report. I thank each one of you for your kind attention. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, Your Ladyship, for your invaluable insights. Now, moving forward, it is our pleasure to now invite Sheila Ramaswamy, Technical and Operational Lead, SAMVAD, and Saurav Sashi-Ashok, former Project Officer, Policy and Law, SAMVAD, to present the key findings from the study report.
Switched off.
Thank you, Shubham. Saurabh, would you like to begin?
Before you begin, Sheila,
Yes.
so the next round, the next session that we have is an open discussion with the authors of the report. So if people attending the session, if you would like to ask any or pose any questions to the authors of the report, you can kindly type in those questions on chat. We'd love to take those once the findings are shared.
Can you hear me, Sheila?
Yes, you're audible. Go ahead, Saurabh.
All right. Yeah. I'd like to begin by thanking all the officers, excuse me, who've joined us today for this program. And of course, with the remarks that Her Ladyship has just provided, I think we have a sort of foundation to discuss why the study was conducted and what is the significance of it, and what we can perhaps take from it as we move forward in this larger conversation on juvenile transfer and Section 15 of the Act. I'm very grateful, as always, to also have His Lordship Honorable Justice Lokur present in this session, and I'm sure when we have the time to listen to some of his Lordship's remarks, we'll also have more questions perhaps than answers, but more interesting insights into this discussion. I will just begin by sharing with all the participants in this discussion today a very brief overview about what this study was, what are the reasons we actually initiated the study, and then proceed to discussing the methodology we had adopted to actually conduct the study before we proceed to discuss some of the important findings and the analysis of the study. Could you move to the next slide, Shubham? Yeah, you can move to the next slide. Yeah. As I mentioned, there is a context within which we had decided to actually conduct the study. One of the primary reasons, and as her leadership had also outlined in her keynote address, was the nature of Section 15. It has been unfailingly a source of much debate and discussion. Section 15 has also been particularly difficult, as all of the officers who are joining us today here well know, to implement. There has been not too much clarity on how a lot of these key aspects or criteria under Section 15 are to be interpreted and implemented, as the leadership had also outlined. And in this context, we felt it is important to really be able to understand from a practical standpoint how the current Section 15 provisions are being implemented. There are various perspectives, of course, on the subject, and there are various perspectives on juvenile transfer. But as I mentioned, our key focus was to understand what are the factors that go into decision making when it comes to Section 15, not just the larger theoretical discussions surrounding the provision, but what are the key factors that actually influence and impact decision making. Until recently, and her leadership had mentioned the Varun Chandra Thakur judgment, which was, of course, issued by the Honorable Supreme Court last year. But apart from the judgment, we did not seem to have too much statutory clarification for what each of the key criteria under Section 15 are supposed to be interpreted as. What is mental capacity? What is understanding of consequences? What do we mean by the circumstances in which the offense took place? We now, however, have the guidelines that have been released, but even so, there are many questions that are still left unanswered. How do we really standardize, and that is the word that her leadership had used, how do we really standardize the implementation of this provision? And that is still a question that remains to be unanswered. In this context, the study was conducted to be able to understand what are some of the aspects of discretion that currently affect the implementation of Section 15. How does discretion influence the interpretation and implementation of Section 15 and possibility of transfer? Is there largely a standardized way of implementing Section 15, or are there a lot of gaps that need to be addressed, right? While a lot of these questions come to mind, of course, there is also, with any form of discretion, the risk of arbitrariness. And that is something that we want to explore when we actually venture into doing the study, was whether there are statutory guidelines that are being adopted in the interpretation and the implementation of Section 15, or are there extra legal factors that play more of a role in the implementation of Section 15? So the key questions that we really sought to address through the study, the first, of course, is what factors do judicial personnel adopt while making decisions with regard to juvenile transfer under Section 15? Which of these factors are most likely to impact the possibility of a juvenile transfer to the children's court? What we also want to explore, and I'll go over this while we discuss the methodology, is what types of cases are more likely to result in the possibility of transfer. Related to this, of course, were other important questions. Is a child-centric perspective in accordance with the Juvenile Justice Act being adopted while decision making on transfer? And what can these findings, of course, tell us in a more significant sense about the importance for judicial education and capacity building, As her ladyship had outlined in her keynote address, there are lots of questions to be answered in terms of judicial education capacity building, and we're also hoping to use the study to inform SAMVAD's own efforts in this regard. Right? Could you move to the next slide, Shubham? Yeah. You can move to the next slide. Yeah. So coming to the methodology, we have had the privilege, of course, over the course of a couple of years now to undertake various judicial deliberation programs with many honorable high courts across the country. We had the opportunity to listen to Honorable Justice Lokur through many of these programs, share some of his own insights. And what we did through these programs was adopt a debate-like approach to questions surrounding the implementation and the interpretation of Section 15. We used a lot of the qualitative data from these programs. What are some of the primary stakeholders in the implementation of this provision? And on the basis of this qualitative data, actually developed a quantitative methodology done various case studies that required to be answered by participating judicial officers. And these case studies were hypothetical case studies based on real cases, of course, across different case contexts and across different domains of questions, right? As her ladyship had mentioned, the study was open to all the stakeholders who were involved with the whole process, Section 15, which is why we'd opened the study to principal magistrates of the juvenile justice boards, special court and children's court judges, as well as district and sessions court judges. We were privileged enough to receive over 742 responses to the study, which really informed a lot of our thinking and understanding of how this is being implemented, right? As I discussed, we'd conducted a series of programs before. The point of a lot of the programs conducted before we had actually developed the study was to understand what are some of the key challenges in the interpretation and implementation of this provision, but to also understand what are some of the key controversies that surround Section 15, so to speak. The main areas that we were seeking to understand the implementation of Section 15 across different case contexts were not just statutory criteria, but also criteria that's not within the statutory framework of Section 15. And so the four domains that you see in the slide before you on the interpretation of mental capacity and developmental stage, the appreciation of pathways through which children have come into conflict with the law and their circumstances, the judicial perceptions of the severity of offense and consequences for the victim, and evaluations of criminal intent while making judicial transfer decisions. These four areas were the areas within which we sought to ask questions and understand through the survey how judicial officers were approaching each of these cases. So each of the cases, the 6 cases that we had adopted in the study, had questions relating to all 4 broad domains. And this influenced our understanding of how judicial officers are looking at, like I mentioned, not just statutory criteria, but also extra legal criteria. That is extremely important in the context of Section 2. I mentioned 6 cases. What we've done for the purposes of the study was to understand different case types, because our hypothesis was that different cases might have different impacts on judicial approaches to transfer. 2 cases had dealt with physical violence leading to, in the context of not just grievous injury, but grievous injury and murder. So 2 cases were basically dealing with the case type of physical violence. We had 2 more cases dealing with sexual violence, both sexual violence resulting in grievous injury and death. And we also had 2 cases dealing with sexual relationships. Sexual relationships, of course, in the context of consenting adolescent relationships, which are criminalized under the POCSO Act. And we felt in that context it would be important to also understand how transfer decision making is affected by this particular these case types, right? You can see the breakup of the case types before you, and why we had sort of actually decided to pick these case types to understand what are some of the key areas that judicial officers are focusing in the context of transfer. Right? You can move to the next slide. Right, so I'll just go over each of the domains I just mentioned. As I mentioned, we have taken 6 cases, but there was a reasoning as to why we chosen each of these areas. The first part, dealing with the interpretation of mental capacity and developmental stage, as her leadership had outlined in the keynote address, there still remains a lot of ambiguity surrounding this concept of mental capacity. What do we mean by mental capacity? How do we differentiate mental capacity from criminal intent, which is a question I will relate to, I will come back to later, and we will discuss more in our presentation of our findings as well. How is mental capacity supposed to be interpreted? Over the course of the past few years, different honorable high courts have had different interpretations of this as well. Some honorable high courts have taken the view that mental capacity is to be interpreted vis-a-vis understanding of consequences, and therefore those two concepts are basically one and the same. Other honorable high courts have taken different views. So what do we understand when we look at judicial approaches to transfer decision making on this question of mental capacity? How do judicial officers see mental capacity, and what role do they assign to mental capacity in the final transfer decision making? Right. Next slide, Shubham. Right. The second important domain that we'd focused on and we'd asked questions in the survey methodology was on the subject of pathways to vulnerability and the vulnerable circumstances of the offender. This again, like mental capacity, is within the statutory framework of Section 15, and so we sought to understand what significance do judicial officers assign to this question of pathways to offending and circumstances within which an offense has taken place. So we'd asked numerous questions, and you can see some examples of the questions or statements that we'd asked under this domain as well, to ask judicial officers to look at what are some of the dysfunctional family circumstances within which the offense has taken place, looking at peer influence, the impact on offending behaviors, right? The larger social environment of the child. So these statements sought to understand whether judicial officers were actually factoring in the pathways surrounding the offense in the final decision making, right? Next slide, Shubha. Right. The next domain that we had really looked at to understand judicial decision making was on the subject of severity and consequences. Now, this is distinct from the first two domains that we had looked at, because this is not within the statutory framework of Section 15. But we nonetheless included this on the basis of a lot of the judicial deliberation programs that we had previously conducted, through which we were able to discern that, in fact, severity of the offense and victim consequences may potentially play an important role in judicial decision making. So we had also posed questions to get a sense of what judicial perspectives were on the severity of the offense and whether this was a factor in the decision making on juvenile transfer finally. You can see some examples of the statements looking at the consequences of the offense for the victim. If X was old enough to participate in the offense, then they understood the consequence of the actions, basically inferring maturity and inferring an understanding of consequences on the basis of the severity of the offense, which again, as I mentioned, is not within the statutory framework, but nonetheless something that came up during our interactions with judicial officers. And of course, the final domain, one of the most controversial and one of the most significant, as our findings had later revealed, was on the subject of criminal intent. Preliminary assessment is not a trial, is something that's within our statutory framework. As we well know, Section 15 itself very explicitly mentions that preliminary assessment is not a trial. The juvenile justice model rules as well explicitly mention that preliminary assessment is not a trial. But what we sought to understand was whether in practice, in implementation, Section 15 does result in the criminalization of adolescent offenders, and what is the impact of the judicial approach to Section 15 that may result in inadvertent estimation of criminal intent. We'll come back to this in our findings and analysis, but what we really sought to understand was whether judicial approaches, particularly in light of the case type and the severity of the offense and the other factors we discussed, whether criminal intent was something that was either explicitly or inadvertently being considered in the implementation of Section 15. And as I discussed during some of our judicial deliberation programs, this point had really come across as very important, and we felt it was imperative for the study to also gauge to what extent this is influencing transfer decisions. And if it is, then of course we know this has adverse consequences for any kind of judicial transfer decision making. We had undertaken statistical analysis as a part of our study, during which we had generated descriptive statistics to understand, levels of judicial child orientation to each of the domains that I just discussed right now, whether it is mental capacity or pathways to offending, or severity of the offense, criminal intent, and so on. But we'd also undertaken univariate and multivariate regression analysis, through which we were basically able to understand the relationship between certain factors affecting judicial decision making and the exact nature of that relationship with the final decision to transfer. So we did not simply look at different factors that potentially were impacting judicial decisions for transfer, but we were able to understand the exact nature of the relationship between these factors and the final decision to transfer, which is basically to say which factors were the most important in judicial decisions to transfer and which factors were the least important in judicial decisions to transfer, right? You'd notice I'd mentioned child orientation a couple of times. What this basically meant was for each of the domains, mental capacity, understanding of consequences, mental capacity, pathways to offending, severity of consequences, and criminal intent, we had posed certain statements and we had shared with you some examples of the statements. And what we looked at in judicial responses to each of these statements was whether or not the statement reflected an understanding of mental capacity, an understanding of pathways to offending, an understanding of, or the approach to severity of the offense, and whether this understanding was in line with a child-oriented approach to decision making, or whether it wasn't in line to a child-oriented approach to decision making. So child-oriented approaches or responses were basically those that were cognizant of children's developmental capacities, their mental health risks, adverse childhood experiences, the vulnerabilities in the family, community, and the risks in these contexts, a belief in the restorative mandate of the Juvenile Justice Act, which is something that Her Ladyship had raised in the beginning of today's session, and an understanding that mental capacity for formation of criminal intent knowledge cannot be inferred just from the nature of the behavior, right? Now, responses that did not reflect these kind of understandings were, of course, responses that we thought were not child-oriented. We understood as not being child-oriented. And these responses told us that judicial officers or participants in the study maybe did not consider some of these key factors in their approaches to the case and in their approaches to transfer decision making. On the basis of these factors, a total case-wise and domain-wise score was generated. So we also had overall scores for each case to tell us across all 4 domains of mental capacity, pathways, severity of the offense, and criminal intent, what are the levels of judicial child orientation, right? And we had for each domain, as I also mentioned, the score to reflect what was the level of child orientation to that particular area of study, right? Yeah. I'd now like to request SAMVAD's technical and operational lead, Sheila Ramaswamy, to proceed with the findings and analysis for the study. Sheila.
Thank you, Saurabh. Moving on to looking at the findings and some analysis. As we said already, 742 judicial officers, so our response rate was approximately 54%. From 16 state high courts and judicial academies, they were representative of 20 states and 3 union territories. So fairly representative and certainly of all regions in the country. Let's look first at case type or the nature of offense and child orientation. You recall Saurabh talked about 3 types of cases we looked at: physical violence, sexual violence, and sexual relationships, each with different consequences. So we found that the highest proportion of child-oriented responses were observed in sexual relationships with contact only, not pregnancy, but just contact. The lowest proportion of child-oriented responses was observed in the case of sexual violence with death. And overall, physical violence cases seem to have a higher level of child-oriented responses than sexual violence cases. This tells us that although the law says that, the law has a whole list of heinous offenses, and the law does not distinguish between one type of heinous offense and another, in decisions, however, this distinction is being made. Decisions of transfer and the weightage given is based on the nature of offense. As you can see, sexual offenses elicit a different type of response altogether, certainly less child-oriented. Now let's get into the domains that Saurabh spoke about. Let's look at interpretation of mental capacity and see how child-oriented the responses were and what the understanding was. We found that in case of physical violence cases, about half the respondents had child-oriented responses. There were higher levels of child-oriented responses to physical violence with grievous injury than death. So death was perceived with greater strictness, perhaps. 55% of child-oriented responses to the sexual relationship contact-only cases. So as you can see, physical violence and sexual relationship in terms of child-friendly responses were reasonably on par. But now look at sexual violence cases. There's a plunge there with child-oriented responses dropping to below 40%. And similarly and interestingly, child-oriented responses dropping to below 40% even in pregnancy, sexual relationship with pregnancy cases. So again, the takeaway here is that mental capacity is viewed differently based on different case types or based on the nature of offense. Again, that is not in consonance with the law in absolute terms, because we're distinguishing between different heinous offenses. Judges are more likely to concede that adolescents do not have mental capacity when it comes to physical violence, very interestingly, as opposed to sexual violence or sexual relationships where mental capacity is perceived to be higher. That, they do have the ability to understand if this is what they're doing, is what the analysis and the data is telling us. It also tells us that sexual violence and even sexual relationship cases where pregnancy is concerned are regarded as more heinous offenses than physical violence. However, that they do not differentiate much between acts of sexual engagement, that is between cases of sexual violence and consenting relationship in terms of the consequences. Coming to appreciation of pathways and circumstances, we have some very interesting findings here. Across case types, irrespective of the severity or the consequences of the offense, 70% of the respondents acknowledge the role of pathways, risks, vulnerabilities, and children's difficult circumstances. So the recognition of children's difficult circumstances is certainly there, and this is in consonance with Section 15's second evaluative criteria on pathways and circumstances of the offense. The highest proportion of child-oriented responses was actually observed in sexual relationships with contact. But what we see is a generally consistent and widespread child orientation to appreciation. But things will change when we talk about transfer. Let's wait for it and see how this is actually applied, although the identification is very much there. Look at the third domain, perception of severity and consequences. The lowest proportion of child-oriented responses pertain to sexual violence, right? Just under 50%, with little variance between grievous injury and death. That is, even the consequences did not seem to affect child orientation in this domain. In case of physical violence with death elicited a lower proportion of child-oriented responses than physical violence with grievous injury and so on. So what this tells us is that judicial personnel do take into consideration severity and consequences of the offense within a given case type. And in addition to nature of case types. Very interesting, because remember, as Saurabh mentioned, this parameter relating to perception of severity and consequences is not part of Section 15's evaluative criteria. The law does not require us to do this. Again, estimation of criminal intent, also not part of the evaluative criteria under Section 15. Tells us, the findings tell us that there's an overwhelmingly low proportion of child-oriented responses to sexual violence cases, again under 40%, as compared to physical violence cases, which had at least 50 to 67% of child-oriented cases. And then that's much higher in sexual relationship cases, where it goes all the way up to 74%. So the variance in proportion of child-oriented responses between the two types of sexual violence cases, that is between grievous injury and death, were negligible, which again says that by just looking at the nature of the offense, that is sexual violence, that itself propels officers to assume a certain degree of criminal intent. There was some variance in the two types of physical violence, however, 67% in case of physical violence with injury and only 50% in case of death. So there is a variance in child orientation there. Some variance in sexual relationships where pregnancy elicited a lower proportion of child-oriented responses, more child orientation in case of sexual contact cases. So again, except in case of sexual violence, wherein the case type was the predominant factor affecting judicial perceptions of mens rea or criminal intent. In other offenses, this perception is impacted both by case type as well as severity or consequences to the victim. Really interesting, I assume many of you are thinking. Now let's come to the bit on transfer. So far we've been talking about how judicial personnel probably weigh all these domains and factors. What do they finally do with them? Look at this bar graph. The red indicates transfer. The blue indicates no transfer. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as you can see, the highest proportion of pro-transfer responses, look at the red bars, are in case of sexual violence. And again, as you can see, there's not much variation between sexual violence with grievous injury and sexual violence with death, 68 versus 64%. And that is followed by physical violence with death, second highest in terms of transfer, 54%, followed by sexual relationship with pregnancy. So there's a consequence and victim consequence issue there. And then we have the other offenses that follow physical violence with grievous injury, sexual relationship with contact, and so on, which are at much lower levels of transfer, although they also constitute heinous offenses. What this essentially tells us is that severity of the offense appears to play a role in transfer. You look at physical violence, sexual relationship offenses, but variation in severity of sexual violence, just like we found in criminal intent, in regard to grievous injury and death, was not really observable even in case of transfer. So as long as it's a sexual offense, whether it results in death or grievous injury, there is a pro-transfer response. So the question is, are judicial officers applying the nature of offense lens more than the severity of consequences lens in case of sexual offenses? Fascinating findings. So now, the question that then follows, and you might ask, and we all want to know perhaps, is which factors then really impinge most on transfer decisions? Because we have 4 factors or 4 domains that we've been discussing. Capacity most weighty, that judicial officers apply most in pro-transfer decisions. And look at it, what the data says. With regard to criminal intent, non-child-oriented responses are 4 times more likely to lead to transfer in consenting sexual relationship case types. Non-child-oriented responses were 3 times more likely to lead to transfer in physical violence and twice as likely to lead to transfer in sexual violence cases. The other variable, mental capacity, didn't have such clear findings. Across all case types, non-child-oriented responses were 1.5 times, 1.5 times more likely to lead to transfer decisions. Pathways and circumstances, that domain was significant to transfer decisions only in a couple of case types, not across the board, not in a majority of case types, only in case of physical violence with grievous injury and sexual relationship resulting in pregnancy. That's the only place where pathways was an important factor, right? Although severity of offense, that's a surprise finding. One would have imagined that the severity of offense or the consequences to the victim may have been of considerable significance, and it was. We are not saying that it was not a factor and that officers don't apply it. The findings tell us that they do weigh up this, but it has not emerged as much of a significant factor as criminal intent and mental capacity. And as you can see, criminal intent is not within the Section 15 criteria. Mental capacity, of course, is. So one parameter that is used is within the legal framework and the other is extraneous to it. The last finding pertains to judicial opinions on the interface between law and child mental health, what Justice Nagaratna also referred to in her opening remarks in terms of to what extent do we work together in transdisciplinary ways. 62% of the officers viewed implementation of preliminary assessments as a fundamentally judicial exercise, meaning that transfer decisions must solely be informed by facts and circumstances of the case. But there was also an overwhelming majority of officers, that is almost all, who also said that it would be most advisable to take the assistance of other professionals, mainly mental health professionals, in conducting preliminary assessments. Now, while these two findings may be contradictory, they actually represent a shared view. And our understanding is that while taking expert assistance is desirable, because they all feel that it is largely so, this is implications of the study. There are we are audible? Okay. The issue of mental capacity, which has emerged very strongly through this study. The question that we really need to think about is, where does knowledge of adolescent neurodevelopment, which Justice Nagaratna also mentioned, find a place in juvenile transfer decisions? This perception that different kinds of offenses involve different kinds of cognitive capacities is a difficult one. And if we look at it particularly in relation to sexual offenses, and her ladyship also alluded to this, how sexual offenses have tended to prompt very intense debates, very strong emotional responses, and how those get reflected in transfer decisions. Although the law does not differentiate between different types of heinous offenses. The issue, friends, is that neurodevelopment research does not support any of these positions. The adolescent brain, as we have often taught in several judicial forums, is architecturally very different from the adult brain because it is still developing. It has not finished developing as the adult brain has. And not even the adult brain, the brain continues to develop till the age of 25, so well beyond 18. Also, that decision-making processes, therefore, are wired very differently in adolescents and adults. In adolescents, they're based on reward-seeking, instant gratification, what adolescents prioritize, and so on, that result in risky behaviors, something that adults do very differently. And that is why when we make a decision in any type of offense that, a given adolescent had adult-like capacities, it actually contradicts any kind of scientific evidence on this. Let's look a little at criminal intent. Again, it's extraneous to Section 15. Why do we continue to apply this parameter is the question. Justice Lokur had a very interesting take on this. He said, after all, judges also live in society. And while there is a judicial obligation to be unbiased, to make decisions and practice law in a manner that is independent, that is not clouded by emotions. And we truly believe that largely our judicial officers absolutely do that. But we want to acknowledge that judicial officers are human. They mirror social milieus, public opinions that may from time to time align with punitive actions, get tough policies, notions like adult crime merits adult time. So the biases that creep in by virtue of simply being human, which we believe is legitimate at whatever level. The other discussions that are important, though, to criminal intent are, one pertains to the unwitting transformation of preliminary assessments into a trial and the application, therefore, of criminal law frameworks. So there tends to be there is a tendency for criminal law functions to be performed by judicial officers. In addition to their mandate under the juvenile justice system, many judges have told us how difficult it is to actually reorient and recalibrate when they sit in the JJ board or when they see cases pertaining to children, which is only once or twice a week, when the rest of the time is spent in the adult criminal justice system. Again, this is understandable. The other issue is that there are overlaps between mental capacity and mens rea. They tend to get interpreted together, but naturally. But if you go back to neurodevelopment and what it says, that adolescents essentially do not have the mental capacity, it automatically follows then that they do not, that the principle of mens rea would not be applicable to them. And even where their actions or their offenses may seem premeditated or pre-planned, as it appears sometimes, it is really, again, a result of high impulsivity, the need for instant gratification, the inability to weigh pros and cons, the absence of life skills, and all of those reasons. It is not akin to criminal intent in the way that the adult criminal justice system applies concepts of mens rea. It's a critical point because the application of the concept of mens rea is very different in the adult criminal justice system. The appreciation of pathways and circumstances. Again, while there is a high degree of child orientation in this regard, but despite that, why judicial officers do not apply this sufficiently when it actually comes to making transfer decision is a curious question. And one possibility is that while there is the recognition of, various kinds of difficult circumstances like child labor, family dysfunction, peer pressure, etc., several other, dropping out of school, so on and so forth, making the link between those factors or circumstances and mental capacity, as in how does child labor actually affect the emotional and mental health of the child, and therefore impact the behaviors of, a given child? That nuance and that depth of understanding is probably what is needed. A deeper understanding, therefore, of how these adverse childhood experiences serve as key risk factors may actually allow for judicial officers to actually apply this parameter, which is so strongly enshrined in the Section 15 provisions. The significance of the study, which Justice Nagaratna briefly alluded to, and we want to reiterate, it is the only large-scale national study on juvenile transfer, the first and only one, not just in India, but in South Asia, to the best of our knowledge. It is also one of the few global studies that moves beyond exploring knowledge and attitudes of judicial officers to actually looking at factors that impinge on decision-making. Interestingly, there aren't very many primary studies, even in the global context. It is, as Justice Nagaratna mentioned, it is also the first systematic and scientific large-scale effort in our own country to look at how preliminary assessment is actually being implemented and whether it's in accordance with the law, with the Section 15 provisions or not. And again, what makes the study special is the transdisciplinary element. It does not look at judicial decision making solely through a legal lens. It integrates the domains of child rights, procedural justice, child mental health, and law, all of which are essential to decisions on juvenile transfer. Finally, the implications and recommendations. First and foremost, of course, the study makes only too clear the imperatives for standardization of interpretation of the evaluative criteria in Section 15, as well as the implementation. And this has been reiterated by the Supreme Court directive, of course, in the Baranchandra Thakur case. But more importantly, from our perspective, and I believe that Justice Lokur strongly echoes this, the implications for judicial education are critical. As Justice Nagaratna also mentioned, the need for a comprehensive training curriculum and content, as SAMVAD has done with the support of very many judges, High Court judges, Justice Lokur, of course, to include not only child law and the provisions of the juvenile justice law, but adolescent neurodevelopment, understanding mental capacities, understanding childhood adversities, vulnerabilities, and risks, and how they link to offense behaviors, the need to maintain rehabilitative and restorative actions, even as we apply transfer laws, and very importantly, the distinct ways in which certain provisions of the law, such as mens rea, are applied in the juvenile justice versus the adult criminal justice contexts. We believe at SAMVAD, and we've also been doing this with many judicial academies across the country already through the curriculum that we've created, that judicial education, particularly when it pertains to child law issues, needs to move from more conventional top-down approaches to alternative methodologies such as deliberations, debates, review consultations, creative and experiential pedagogies, and so on, to accommodate and afford opportunities for reflective learning. Our work across the country with several state judicial academies has been truly joyous, I believe, and judicial officers have had a lot of fun and done a lot of deep thinking and reflection when we've done these 3.5 day programs to really immerse ourselves in children's issues, in children's lives. Only then, we believe, can justice really be done where children are concerned. The other recommendation pertains to multiple levels of training. This is So this is again, Justice Lokur had this recommendation that we must do 3 levels. Level 1 is induction training for all judicial magistrates of first class. That is a broad orientation on all civil and criminal child law matters, ranging from adoption to child sexual abuse to custody to juvenile justice. In fact, Karnataka has already been doing this over the last 2 years, providing this sort of orientation to all the 1,000-odd judicial officers in the state. This was as per Justice Nagaratna's direction that this initiative has been taken by Karnataka's Judicial Academy. At level 2, Justice Lokur suggested a focused one-day orientation for newly designated principal magistrates so that they have some understanding of the juvenile justice system before they take on their new job on the JJ board. And at level 3 is the depth training program that I already referred to, that should ideally be for 3.5 days to look at integrating legal, mental health, and, of course, child rights and procedural justice issues for JJB magistrates and children's courts judges. The last recommendation is actually, well, not unnecessary, but much talked about and almost redundant for the number of times we've said it. It is not just judicial officers who need this sort of education. It is also child protection functionaries and mental health service providers. Again, SAMVAD has been trying its best to get the mental health world to keep pace with the legal developments and all the new laws that are coming up for children, so that we also train and educate mental health professionals. It's not an easy task, as you can imagine, but we persist and will continue to do so. Thank you very much for your attention. That brings us to the end of our findings, and we will shortly open the floor to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you, Sheila, for expertly guiding us through the findings of this report. As mentioned, we will now have an open discussion with the authors of the study report. It is my pleasure to introduce and invite Honorable Justice Madan B. Lokur, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, and former Chairperson, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee, Supreme Court of India, Dr. John V. Sagar, Principal Investigator at SAMVAD and Head of Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, NIMHANS, Dr. Shekhar Seshadri, Advisor at SAMVAD and former Senior Professor, Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and former Director, NIMHANS, Sheila Ramaswamy, Technical and Operational Lead at SAMVAD, and Saurabh S. Ashok, the former Project Officer, Policy and Law at SAMVAD. We invite our participants to kindly type in their questions in the chat box. Given that we have over 600 participants online with us, I request that the questions are typed into the chat box and we can facilitate the discussion around these questions. We already have questions coming in, so I request Shubham to lead us in with the first question.
Thank you, Nandita. So the first question that we have for the panel is that across the board, Commission of Sexual Offences has shown lower child-oriented responses. So could you please help us understand the reasons for this better? Honorable Justice Lokur, if you would like to take up this question.
Sir, could you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, before I answer that question, I want to congratulate SAMVAD on this really wonderful, research and study that they have done. And I also want to congratulate all the judicial officers, who participated, because without them, the study could not have been conducted. So congratulations to everybody who's here for, providing this wonderful opportunity to study the entire issue of interpretation of Section 15 and its actual implementation. Now, I had mentioned it earlier, and Sheila had also adverted to it, that everybody has, some kind of a bias which is hidden at some point of time because of something that may have happened 20 years ago when you were a student, or when you were in college, or when you were just beginning to start work. Now, those biases could be of a different kind. It need not necessarily be about something social like caste or religion or something. It need not be something like that, but it could be of something to do with procedure, or with something to do with an offense that has been committed, or something that has happened which you think is wrong. Now that, sometimes creeps into the decision-making process. So when we talk about, the exercise of discretion, we have to be very careful that when we exercise discretion, it is not discretion of what I think, but it has to be judicial discretion, which is to say that, you have the evidence before you, you have the law before you, and then on the basis of that, of course, with the assistance of learned counsel, you arrive at a decision. Now, in a case of Section 15, for example, you will have issues of physical violence. All right. Now, somebody might give importance to physical violence. Oh, this fellow has committed a murder. Murder is very bad. And, so therefore, I think that the matter should be transferred. Somebody may say that, well, sexual violence is going on. I mean, we've had so many dowry deaths in the country. It's all right if some girl gets beaten up by her boyfriend or something. So it's not something very serious. And so therefore, I don't want to transfer it. Now, that is not an exercise of judicial discretion. That is an exercise of personal impressions, personal discretion, personal thoughts. And I think this, influences the decision making in some manner or the other. And like I said, it's hidden. We don't realize it, but we need to think about it at different points of time. I think this is the reason why some categories of cases are transferred more frequently to the regular courts, to the regular criminal courts, and some are not. Now, you could have something like, what are called romance cases or elopement cases. Now, theoretically, if, a young boy and a young girl elope, there's a violation of the law. I mean, POCSO might be involved in that. But we look at it as something which is natural, which may happen to a person, an adolescent. So we say that, well, in a situation like this, give the benefit of doubt to the boy and the girl. Why should they be prosecuted? Why should they be sent to jail? And then, quash the case. And very often the FIR itself is quashed under these circumstances. So these are things that happen, and we have to be alive to the fact that these things actually happen. And either we accept them as they are, or we say that, well, they should not be taken into consideration. I think we have to look at it, on a case-to-case basis, and then try and figure out why is it that some category of cases by a particular person or a particular judge has actually gone to the criminal court, and why some have not. You find that happening very often now, in the higher courts, in the constitutional courts, in the high courts, in the Supreme Court, where lawyers say that, well, or even litigants, they say that, once it goes in to the court, I'm not going to get bailed. This thing is beginning to happen, and we have to be conscious of that. And it is only then that we can answer, questions like the one that has been raised. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think this brings us to another question that was asked on this chat by Shri Ashish Tripathi ji, who's a children's court judge in the Bhadrak district. Sir, the age of consent in India is 18. So is there any difference between consensual relationships and sexual violence, as any wrong sexual conduct is punishable under the POCSO Act. If Dr. Shishadri or Dr. John would like to bring a transdisciplinary perspective to this question.
Thank you very much, Nandini. In point of fact, every year, sometime in December, the Honorable Supreme Court of India holds a consultation in the premises of the court on JJ. And in December last year, the whole issue was around POCSO and recently on children in conflict with law. And in fact, even the Honorable Chief Justice of India's address and the major content that was discussed in the POCSO consultation was about the criminalization of consenting adolescent relationships. So this business of close in age exception on the one hand, and then to look at the extent to which there is a consenting adolescent relationship and not criminalizing that, and to look at adult perpetration on younger children, and to look at a 17 or an 18-year-old, but with either a younger child, or, for example, the whole context of the Nirbhaya case itself, which was the start of why the JJ Act 2015 came into being. There is something that needs, I think, to be repeated and understood in all its context, complexity, and importance, which is not just a thought, not just a proposition, but perhaps the truth that every child in conflict with law was, and continues to be a child in need of care and protection. If you look at all the factors that we've discussed today, neurodevelopment, adverse childhood experiences, peer influence, and all the frustrations that go with the kind of lives of children who come into conflict with law. So I think we need to keep in mind this framework as we take a perspective in a given instance of how we orient ourselves to actually provide the right decision for that child, that adolescent in conflict with law. This is the framework. In fact, Saurabh, Sheila, and I have written a paper on the adolescent consent binary. I don't know, Saurabh, you have any thoughts on this quickly?
Hi, so could you just repeat that? I think your audio was breaking.
No, it was about the adolescent consent binary and this business of, when there is sexual violence perpetrated by an alleged perpetration by an adolescent.
Right.
And the whole issue of age of consent, consensual relationship, sexual violence. Right. Because under POCSO, and this is what we've been discussing, not to criminalize consenting relationships.
Right, sir. I think it's an interesting question and an important one. And as we had also written about in the article, that it's quite interesting to look at how consent provisions exist under the POCSO Act. And this is a point that we often forget, that there is no explicit provision, so to speak, with regard to sexual consent under the POCSO Act. It is by omission that we have a situation wherein the child is defined up to the age of 18. And since nobody under the age of 18 can be allowed to be engaged in any kind of sexual intercourse, by omission, we have a situation wherein no consenting relationship has any legal validity under the Act. And that is an important distinction to make. The POCSO Act does not have any explicit provisions for sexual consent. All of our inferences as to sexual consent come from the age specified under the POCSO Act. And so the question in that sense to reframe the discussion is whether that omission itself is important enough to treat consensual sexual relationships between adolescents and cases of sexual violence as one and the same. But more importantly, in the context of the discussion that we are having today, not just in the context of the overarching discussion of sexual consent, it's interesting to note the question that the honorable officer had asked, that both of these acts as being violative of the POCSO Act are equally punishable. But the discussion that we're having today is not about punishment. And we do often forget that. We're talking about juvenile transfer today, right? And juvenile transfer, even though it envisages a transfer to children's court and potentially a higher degree of punishment, is not inherently supposed to be punitive. The fact that the Juvenile Justice Act goes through such large measures to ensure that even a child who's transferred is still supposed to have an individual care plan, that the child is still supposed to have a child-friendly trial at children's court. So the provision is not supposed to be inherently punitive. So when we look at consensual sexual relationships in the context of transfer, we have to ask whether these consensual sexual relationships meet even the threshold under Section 15. What is the nature in which the offense took place? What would be a proportionate response? What is a child's understanding of consequences, which is an exceedingly important point, as we had also discussed, in the article, especially in consensual sexual relationships where adolescents do not possess the requisite information to make informed sexual decisions. And what is their mental capacity to make these decisions? So I think that on one level, we need to of course, discuss, what it really means to talk about adolescent consensual sexual relationships and the issues with the POCSO legislation. But secondly, and more importantly, we are not talking about punishment right now, we're talking about transfer. So what is the distinction there, and how do we look at consensual sexual relationships in the context of transfer? That's, yeah.
Shubham and Nandita, before you go on to some other questions, I have noted that many of the honorable judicial officers have been talking about the dearth of mental health professionals to assist in the preliminary assessment and about training. I just wanted to mention on behalf of SAMVAD that SAMVAD has already started our definitive forensic training across states in the district mental health programs for mental health professionals on child forensics. One part of it is, of course, the assistance that can be provided in conducting preliminary assessment. So we are in the process of doing this. We also do extensive training of the police and other stakeholders as far as this kind of process and assessment is concerned.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Saurabh. So the next question is by Raghuvangshi Ji, who is the Principal Magistrate of the Juvenile Justice Board at Gatehiroli. So, sir asked the question that when we closely observe, there is some or the other vulnerability present in almost every CICL. In such a scenario, whether we need to relook the amendment providing for transfers to 16 to 18-year-olds in the country?
Yes. It's a very interesting question. That is precisely our point. If you look, sir, at the NIMHANS methodology, let me be unequivocal. For reasons of adolescent neurodevelopment and, of course, because of child rights, procedural justice, and several other reasons, the NIMHANS preliminary assessment methodology is constructed in such a manner that it actually directs or propels the concerned judicial officer to move towards rehabilitation and restorative action rather than transfer. Because your observation that if you look closely at any given child, there is vulnerability is absolutely true. Because if there weren't, then that child would not come in conflict with the law. And I just want to add by saying, even children who come from upper socioeconomic stratas of society, the so-called wealthy families, and on the surface of it, it appears like, they've got it all, the opportunities for good schooling, shelter, healthcare, etc. If we really were to look in a more nuanced way at what family factors and issues are playing out, a lot of
I think they are logged out.
Yes, sir. We just kindly bear with us for 2 minutes while we get back online.
Yeah, you're on. Yes, we are on, Nandita. Carry on.
Yes, sir. Visible now. Visible and audible.
Sorry, I don't know. Perhaps I wasn't audible towards the end. I was just saying that it would be important to really look even in upper socioeconomic strata families for issues such as neglect and abuse, because they're cross-cutting themes in adverse childhood circumstances. They're not restricted to just children who come from poor or difficult circumstances. And therefore, the point that the honorable judge makes to look very deeply at these nuances and then to look at more restorative and rehabilitative action becomes critical. That is to retain the child within the juvenile justice system and move towards restorative action rather than transfer. Given particularly that the evidence for rehabilitation and restoration to prevent further engagement in offense or to prevent recidivism is far greater than if you transfer the child. Lots of research to show that when we transfer children, the chances that they actually get into further criminal activity as adults because they've not been provided with rehabilitation opportunities adequately are greater. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheila.
Yeah, go ahead, Shubham.
Yes. So due to the paucity of time, we'll be taking the last two questions for this session. The rest of the questions, if my members have other questions as well, we'll be more than happy to take them up after the session. We'll be more than happy to write to you about with the answers to these questions as well. So this is a question by the District and Sessions Court Valsad and the ADJ from Mahasena. The question is that Section 29 and 30 of POCSO Act provides for presumption. Section 30 provides for presumption of existence of mental state, and it shall be a defense for the accused to prove the fact that he had no such mental state. So once there is a presumption under Section 30 of POCSO, is there any need to decide the mental capacity under Section 15 of the JJ Act?
I'd just like to, could I just respond to this, Shubham?
Sure, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts on this subject because it does raise a larger question. And this is partly why we had, factored in criminal intent in the study as well. Because the presumption as to the mental state of the accused is a presumption in the context of the trial. It is not equivalent or in any way related to what we're trying to find out when we look at mental capacity under Section 15. The presumption as to the mental state of the accused is a question that, of course, needs to be answered at trial and after the prosecution discharges an initial burden to just lay the foundation of facts and to provide at least a prima facie case. Then the presumption, of course, is there's one, of course, the presumption of guilt, and then there's also the presumption as to the mental state of the accused. But both those presumptions are applicable only in the context of a trial. What we're looking at in mental capacity is a question that we ask before we ask any question of intent or the mental state of the accused. Does this person have the capacity to form intention? Is what the question of mental capacity is asking. It's not asking any questions about intention. It's only asking whether this particular person has the capacity to form that kind of intention. And then we move on to the question of whether this person actually had the intention of committing the act. Now, in theory, both of these things seem to make sense. But in practice, and what we also saw through the study, is that criminal intent and mental capacity, as the question also reflects, are a lot more enmeshed with each other than we would like them to be, which is where the whole point about the preliminary assessment becoming like a trial comes into place. The simplest example we can take of murder, to just consider one case. Section 300 will say that murder is not just intention, it also has a knowledge component to it. Section 15 also says knowledge of consequences. Now, if a principal magistrate is supposed to look at knowledge of consequences under Section 15 in a case of murder, how is the information collected going to be substantively different from, say, knowledge under Section 300? And will it not result in a situation where many instances of children actually not just confessing to having committed the offense, but providing a description of the offense during the stage of preliminary assessment? And when that information is provided, how do we say that the preliminary assessment is still a preliminary process and not a trial? This is also further compounded by the fact that many judicial officers have expressed during our training programs that they are unsure of whether a admission can be recorded in the preliminary assessment report. And we have always maintained that an admission or a confession must never be recorded in the preliminary assessment report, because that will have the effect of prejudicing the trial that takes place if the child is transferred to the children's court. So in fact, and as the question itself reflects, there is too much of an overlap perhaps between criminal intent and mental capacity, even though in theory we would like them to be separate, but in practice I think that is a little bit harder.
Perhaps Justice Lokur, you'd like to comment on this?
Yeah, yes. I agree entirely with what Saurabh has said. I just want to add, one, that every presumption in law is rebuttable. Okay, please don't forget that. Even if you say that, well, Section 30 applies even for a preliminary assessment, which it does not. But even at the stage of a trial, even if there is a presumption under Section 30, it is a rebuttable presumption. And every person accused of an offense is entitled to rebut the presumption, even though it may be statutory. So please keep that in mind, when you're dealing with a case of this nature. But of course, what Saurabh has said is correct, that when we are talking about preliminary assessment, this question of, a presumption does not arise. But I'm saying that even if it does arise, which it does not, but if it does arise in a trial, please remember that it is rebuttable. And the accused person has a right to, rebut that presumption. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Saurabh. Thanks, Sheila. We have another interesting question from the Honorable Shri Justice Abhay Ahuja of the Bombay High Court. No doubt the impetus by SAMVAD study for transdisciplinary training methodologies towards a more realistic and standardized interpretation of mental capacity is the need of the hour. Could we consider reliance of the JJB upon the opinion of a committee of psychologists or experts in transfer decision making, as we usually do under the MTP Act? If any of the authors would like to.
Yes, I'll respond to that. We've had these requests before. It would be an excellent idea to empanel psychologists, psychiatrists, have a multidisciplinary team of mental health professionals who are trained in the preliminary assessment methodology as directed by the Barun Chandra Thakur case. States such as Andhra Pradesh and Telangana actually had put forth that idea, and I believe they are working on empaneling persons such as this. And SAMVAD would be happy then to offer assistance and training both on the mental health and legal aspects. So thank you, Honorable Justice, for your question. It's an excellent suggestion, and perhaps all states should do it this way. It would also address the problems pertaining to arbitrariness and perhaps some overuse of judicial discretion and so on, and that would perhaps in turn assist the high courts greatly if cases at district and state level were taken up in this manner.
SAMVAD also has done extensive mapping of the mental health assistance that is available across the 700 odd districts in the country, including some of the tertiary care institutions. And part of our work, in fact, we are going to be starting a third forensics training program just in a couple of days here, where we are expecting about 20 or 25 mental health professionals to come from all parts of the India. We hope that they in turn will train other mental health professionals as part of the district mental health program in their respective states. So we are trying to create a network of practitioners of this nature who will actually contribute to the building expertise on assistance in preliminary assessment as long as this provision exists. I also wanted to say that while this session today is really for the release of this report, and SAMVAD is privileged, honored, and delighted that so many of you, almost 650 plus from so many parts of the country, have logged in. And we've also noted many other issues that have been put on chat. And I think what we will be doing going ahead is to see if we can curate another session after we have ascertained the convenience of the various judicial officers to take some of these issues that you have put, which we could not address today, and curate another session.
We have also noted your questions and noted who asked them. Yeah. So our team will send you a written response to your question in the coming days. So rest assured, if you didn't have your question responded to on the session because of the paucity of time, we will write to all the judicial officers who've put forward queries.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sheila. Do we take one more question, one final question? Since there is a lot of curiosity, one final question for today. While delays are sometimes inevitable, is time a factor that has to be considered when it comes to making transfer decisions? Is conducting the preliminary assessment test time-bound?
Absolutely. We have, in fact, recently addressed this issue. Preliminary assessment is a time-sensitive assessment. In fact, we have recently responded to this in writing. Sheila has recently drafted a substantive response to this. Sheila?
Yeah. The reasons why the preliminary assessment is time sensitive, because the law itself is trying to ascertain the mental capacity and the knowledge of consequences of the child at the time of the offense. So ideally, this assessment should be done within a period of a month, maximally within 3 months, because mental capacity is a dynamic and evolving concept. So a child who is 17, an adolescent who's 17 years old and engages in an offense today, we can't be doing the preliminary assessment 8 months down the line, 1 year down the line, because his or her mental capacities have already changed. So we're not answering the question that's in the law. The second thing is the problem that arises because of the third evaluative criteria relating to consequences. Now, we are trying to ascertain whether the child understood the consequences of his or her actions at the time of the offense. Soon after the commission of the offense, when the child is apprehended by the police, put in the observation home, and in fact, even within a matter of days and weeks, the child's understanding of consequences has changed because of the contamination, if you like, that occurs, because everybody by then is telling the child, you know what you did, and did you not think what would happen? So when you do the preliminary assessment already a month or 3 months later, that's late, but at least then, further than that, the child has thoughts and the child responds to you saying, yes, you know, these are the consequences. That is inherently unfair because the child is telling you what he or she knows now, long after the commission of the offense. These are the two criteria, mental capacity and the knowledge of consequences, that make preliminary assessment a time-sensitive assessment. So I understand that many high courts have left it to the discretion of mental health professionals, or they have directed for assessments to be done 2 years later, 3 years later. We've had people come to NIMHANS, I believe, several years later. It is not doable. And when it is not doable, because a lot of time has lapsed, our recommendation then, once again, from a mitigation perspective, is to go in the direction of rehabilitation, because I guess we would have to give the benefit of doubt to the person concerned because we were not able to do the assessment within the time frame. And therefore, the safest option, once again, would be to direct the adolescent or the young adult, as the case may be, in the direction of rehabilitation. Right. Thank you for that. And let's have the closing remarks, Nandita.
Thank you. I sincerely thank all the authors for the discussion and bringing in the much needed nuance from different disciplines on the issue of juvenile transfer. We are now pleased to invite Honorable Justice Madan B. Lokur and Dr. Shekhar Seshadri to deliver the concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you. As far as I'm concerned, I think the study is extremely important, not only in the context of juvenile justice, but I think in the larger context of criminal jurisprudence. Right? We've had studies that have been undertaken, for example, on issues of death penalty. Right? That is post the conviction. Should the person be awarded death penalty or should not be awarded death penalty? The Supreme Court has recently pronounced on it, and they have said that certain factors must be considered. There must be an evaluation and so on and so forth. But that is post-conviction. Here, when we are talking about transfer, we are talking about a stage, pre-trial stage, so to speak. Whether the person should be transferred, whether the case should be transferred to a regular court or should not be transferred to a regular court. Now, as far as the child is concerned, it's a very, very important decision which is going to have an impact on the rest of the life of the child. For example, if the person is not required to be transferred, the preliminary assessment shows that it's not a fit case for being transferred for whatever reason. But there is an error of judgment and the case is transferred to a regular court. It's going to have a serious impact because the maximum punishment, as you know, under the JJ Act is 3 years. All right. And that's also not in a regular prison, but it's in one of these safety homes. Now here, the person will have to go to jail, perhaps, undergo life sentence, maybe 10 years, depending upon the nature of the offense, and will be in an adult jail. Okay. So this is going to have a very, very serious impact on the life of the child. Similarly, a person who knows exactly what he's doing. Now, there are persons, recently you would have read about some person who has run away to the United States at the age of 17 on a false passport. And there's an Interpol red corner notice for him. Now, this person is supposed to be a, hired killer in India, managed to run away to the United States. Now, a person like that, if that person is caught and then, said that, okay, you need not go to an adult court, but you go to a regular court, to a JJB. Again, it's going to have a very serious impact, not for this person, but in the case of society, in a situation like this. So that is why I think the entire discussion of Section 15 on the transfer of cases is a very, very important discussion. From the point of view of criminal jurisprudence, from the point of view of child rights. And whenever exercise of discretion has to take place, it has to be done very, very carefully. Outside assistance, wherever available, must be taken. I personally don't think there should be any reason to be hesitant about it. You will remember many years ago in the 1980s, when environmental jurisprudence was just beginning, the Supreme Court took the assistance of committees, not one committee, but 3 committees in one particular case, to find out whether there should be a ban on quarrying of limestone. Why? Because the Supreme Court said that, listen, we don't have the expertise. There are experts who are available. Let us get knowledge, wisdom, understanding from these experts and then take a decision. So whatever decision that any one of us takes in a matter of Section 15, let's always look at the fact that what is the philosophy of the Juvenile Justice Act. It is to try and reform a child who has committed an offense. It is to rehabilitate that person. It is to reintegrate that person into society. It is not, deterrence. It is not retribution. Now, once you appreciate that philosophy of the Juvenile Justice Act, the entire philosophy of child rights and Child Rights Convention, you will realize the importance of a decision under Section 15. And it is in this context that I believe that this report is of tremendous importance. It may be a little heavy to read, but I think it should be made compulsory reading for anybody who's going to be in charge of a juvenile justice board, a principal magistrate, and for the honorable judges of the High Court who are members of the Juvenile Justice Committee, to understand that what is it that the law is trying to achieve and how best can it be achieved. So really, I think it's a tremendous job that has been done by SAMVAD, and like I said in the beginning, tremendous assistance given by all the judicial officers in helping in the preparation of the report. My only regret, and I must say that, my only regret is that only 16 high courts out of 25 seem to have responded. I wish every high court, had responded. But this is not the end of it. This is not the end of the study. And I'm sure other high courts will also join in. Thank you very much, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you, Justice Lokur. From SAMVAD's perspective, friends, we were essentially set up as a national initiative and integrated resource for child protection, mental health, and psychosocial care. We are operating now in 29 states and 4 union territories with mental health professionals, with childcare institutions, staff, with educational institutions and boards, and with the policy and law sector. So we work extensively with the state and national police academy, the state and national legal services authorities, and the state and national judicial academy, essentially to work on this principle enunciated by Honorable Justice Nagaratna in her opening remarks on a transdisciplinary approach. So whether it was POCSO, and we said it is not enough for a mental health professional to diagnose trauma symptoms in a child. He or she has to know the secondary victimization and re-traumatization that occurs in police and judicial processes. So I need to know what 161 statement, 164 statement, and what happens to a child between something coming to be known in an FIR and 161, 164 charges being framed, and then the case coming to court, direct cross argument, sentencing if guilty, and acquittal if in all this process and the time that it takes, what happens to. So I need to know these processes. Similarly, it's not enough for a judge, I guess, to listen to testimony and adjudicate. Who is the child? 3 years old, 6 years old with intellectual disability, 9 years old with hearing and speech problem, 14 years old with severe incapacitating trauma. So a judge would need to know developmental and mental health implications of evidence gathering. And this is the kind of transdisciplinary approach that we have brought even into children in conflict with law. And in the recently completed consultation in the Honorable Supreme Court on children in conflict with law, Sheila and I presented SAMVAD's work, which we are executing now under the leadership of Dr. John, who is heading SAMVAD. We believe, like I said, that there are enough provisions in the JJ Act, whether it's principles of diversion or place of safety, to really, as Justice Lokur pointed out, to move from deterrence to diversion, to move from retribution to rehabilitation, reformation, and restorative practices. And we believe that these are the principles and ideologies that we would like to hold and propagate as far as our work on child protection, mental health, and psychosocial care is concerned. On behalf of SAMVAD, I'd also like to state that we would be honored to work with all state high courts and judicial academies in this partnership and collaboration, so that we can work together in building a scaffolding and a network that truly recognizes what I believe are two key words in the two institutions under the JJ Act. I believe that in the Child Welfare Committee, the critical word is welfare, and in the Juvenile Justice Board, the critical word is justice. And what restorative justice actually means is the principle that we would like to uphold. Thank you very much for your presence. And it is remarkable in this 2-hour program that the attrition rate has been insignificant. And this is really a testament to the kind of deep interest that the judiciary has in matters pertaining to children. And as child mental health professionals, I cannot say how delighted we are that the judiciary has this kind of love and interest and depth of reflection as far as children's lives are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Lokur. Thank you, Dr. Sheshadri. We hope that today's discussions on judicial decision making in the context of juvenile transfer have been valuable to you all. We are grateful to all participants for joining us today for the launch. The SAMVAD team, as mentioned, is available on email to address any further queries regarding the study report or any inquiries pertaining to SAMVAD's work, particularly in light of today's discussions of implementing the preliminary assessment pro forma. Our email ID is provided on the screen, and we will also enter it in the chat box below. It is our pleasure to now invite Dr. John Vijay Sagar, Principal Investigator at SAMVAD and Head of Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, NIMHANS, to render the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Nandita. It's my pleasure and privilege to propose the vote of thanks for today's session. On behalf of the SAMVAD team, I thank you all for joining us today for the successful launch of the study report, Factors Impacting Judicial Decision Making on Juvenile Transfers in India. On this August occasion, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Honorable Justice B.V. Nagaratna, Judge, Supreme Court of India and member, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee of the Supreme Court, for joining us today. Ma'am, it was an absolute privilege to have you deliver the opening remarks. I am sure that they have left each one of us present in this gathering with a deep sense of inspiration. I am also grateful to Honorable Justice Madan B. Lokur, former Judge, Supreme Court of India and former Chairperson, Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee of the Supreme Court, for co-authoring this study report and lending his expertise to the discussions today. It is always a pleasure listening to you, sir. Your guidance and mentorship have been invaluable to the SAMVAD team, and we are deeply indebted to you for your unwavering support. This study would not have been possible but for the proactive support of the high courts and judicial academies of the states. Our warmest appreciation for the judicial officers who took time from their busy schedules to join us today. I also express my sincere gratitude to the Honorable High Courts of Patna, Madras, Guwahati, Calcutta, Madhya Pradesh, Allahabad, Punjab and Haryana, Jharkhand, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Meghalaya, Tripura, Manipur, Telangana, Kerala, and Andhra Pradesh. That the Honorable Chief Justices and the Honorable Juvenile Justice Committees of these high courts granted permission for such a study to be conducted in their states is a certain indication of their interest and commitment to enhancing the role of the judiciary in the lives of children. I would like to express my gratitude to the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, whose vision and support has enabled SAMVAD to engage in learning collaborations that facilitate knowledge creation and dissemination on critical aspects of child mental health, protection, and law. I thank all the participants who have joined us today. As Professor Shekhar sir was mentioning that more than 650 participants, I think it's recently for our programs, whatever we conduct online sessions, it's a record of sorts, I would like to say. I thank all participants from different institutions or organizations for having taken time off your busy schedule and joined us today for this program. Your interest and commitment to child protection is heartening. In fact, I would like to say that it has been today's session, the 2-hour session has been a great learning experience for the entire SAMVAD team. We hope that this study will inform and enrich the thinking on juvenile transfer and indeed on the manner of implementation of juvenile justice in India and elsewhere to better ensure that the protection and legal decisions address the vulnerabilities and lived realities of children in conflict with the law. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We once again extend our gratitude to all our guests who have joined us today for the launch of the study report. Our email ID is mentioned on the chat, so please take note of it. And in case you have any queries, any doubts regarding the study or anything to do with CICLs or children in general, please reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to provide any assistance that we can. Thank you all and wishing you a wonderful weekend ahead.
And a happy Diwali to everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
पूर्व शुभकामनाएं, खुश रहें, स्वस्थ रहें.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.